The air in the subterranean chamber was a living thing, thick with the scent of ozone and ancient parchment, pressing down on me like a shroud. I still feel it, that oppressive weight, even now, miles away, years later. It clings to my skin, a residue of the terror I unearthed beneath the very foundations of the church. The priests, their faces obscured by the dim, sickly glow of the tallow candles, had called me there for a reason they dared not utter aloud. A secret so profound it twisted the light itself, making it bend away from me as if I were a void. They only whispered of my supposed immunity, the only one death fears, a phrase that tastes like ash in my mouth, a cruel jest I've come to understand as an unbreakable curse. I had always considered myself a scholar of the arcane, a connoisseur of the forbidden, drawn to the shadowed corners where history unravels and forgotten truths lie dormant. My life had been a meticulous excavation of the esoteric, a careful sifting through grimoires and lost texts, always from a safe, academic distance. I was an observer, never a participant. That was my first mistake, my most unforgivable error. I should have turned away when I felt the psychic chill, the tangible wrongness of the place, before their cloaked figures even gestured towards the table. The marble beneath my fingertips was not cool and inert. It was slick with a cold sweat, like living flesh. It pulsed with a faint, insistent rhythm, mirroring the frantic beat in my own chest. That rhythmic hum, I realize now, was the basilica itself. A vast, stone heart thrumming with untold secrets, and I had stumbled into its darkest ventricle. They presented me with the parchment, unfurling it with a reverence that bordered on dread. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, a relic from a time, before our current understanding of the cosmos. The vellum, impossibly thin yet incredibly resilient, was the color of dried blood, and the script, I thought I was imagining it, until the ink began to coil and writhe before my very eyes, like living smoke, shifting patterns in defiance of any physical law. My breath hitched. I was the man who catalogued the forgotten, who deciphered the impossible. But this was beyond comprehension. My academic training screamed for a rational explanation, but my gut, that primitive alarm system, screamed for flight. But I kept reading, compelled by a force stronger than reason, stronger than self-preservation. It was a compulsion, a dark current pulling me deeper into the abyss. The language was a twisted form of Aramaic, fused with symbols I'd never seen in any known theological or occult text. Glyphs that seemed to vibrate, imprinting themselves directly onto my consciousness, bypassing my optic nerves entirely. Each character was a barbed hook, snagging my mind, pulling it taut. The text spoke of the slumbering void, of the architect of absence, and the great unmaking. It detailed rituals not of summoning, but of unsummoning, of excising something from the fabric of reality itself. I didn't realize then that the knowledge I was gaining was not merely information, but a binding agent, a sticky tar that would forever attach me to the thing I was meant to understand. The names. Oh, the names. They were not names as we understand them, pronounceable sounds or coherent syllables. They were a violation of phonetics, guttural screeches and dissonant hums that resonated deep within my bones, not my ears. They were descriptors, attributes, but each one carried the weight of a universe unmade. He who is not, the whisper beyond the veil, the glacial breath of nullity. As I pieced together the fragments, my mind struggled, pushing against the encroaching madness, trying to reconcile the impossible with the stark reality of the words before me. This wasn't a man. It wasn't an angel, a demon, or even a god. It was something else entirely. An existential horror, a flaw in creation itself. I felt a cold dread bloom in my chest, a flower of pure terror unfurling its petals. The parchment detailed how this entity, if such a concrete term could even apply, had once been bound, banished to the outer reaches of non-existence, its memory erased from all but the most ancient, most forgotten codices. The ritual outlined was not to kill, but to uncreate it, to sever its very connection to being. But why were they planning this now? What had disturbed its slumber? The priests remained silent, stoic figures in the flickering gloom, their gazes fixed on me, expectant. Their silence was more terrifying than any threat, for it implied a truth too immense, too dreadful to voice. I heard the faint, distant sounds of the city above, a muted murmur that seemed impossibly far away. A normal world I was rapidly losing my connection to. My hands, I noticed, were shaking. Not from fear alone, but from the sheer cognitive dissonance, the tectonic shift occurring within my perception of reality. The academic shell I'd built around myself, painstakingly constructed from years of study and rational thought, was cracking, splintering under the pressure of this new, monstrous truth. I was an archaeologist of the absurd, and I had just unearthed the void. The sheer audacity of the church, believing they could manipulate such a force, was staggering. Or perhaps they weren't manipulating it. Perhaps they were merely tools, pawns in a cosmic game they barely understood. This thought was almost worse, for it stripped away any comforting illusion of human control. The text spoke of an anchor, a terrestrial point through which this entity's influence subtly seeped into our world, a leak in the fabric of reality that was growing. The ritual required finding this anchor, identifying it, and then performing a specific series of incantations, not to destroy, but to reseal the breach. The thought solidified in my mind. This wasn't an assassination, this was containment. And I was apparently the only one capable of discerning the true nature of the threat from the cryptic prose. I remembered the words, "the only one death fears." Perhaps it wasn't fear of me, but fear of my knowledge, my unique ability to understand what others could not, a conduit for truths that could unravel existence. My gaze fell upon a particular symbol, a recursive helix that seemed to coil endlessly inward, swallowing light. It was repeated throughout the text, a recurring motif that felt like a signature. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a key to its identity, to its location, to its method of anchoring itself. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt as though I was seeing through veils, through layers of reality, glimpsing the raw, unfiltered chaos that underpinned everything. Later, I would understand that this symbol was not merely a representation, but a fragment of the entity's very being, a resonant frequency that once perceived could never truly be unheard. I started to read aloud, my voice a ragged whisper in the cavernous space. The priests leaned in, their shadows elongating, consuming the last vestiges of the candle flame. The air grew colder, thick with an unseen presence. Each word I uttered felt like a stone dropping into a bottomless well, sending ripples through the silence. I was translating not just words, but concepts, bringing a forgotten horror back into the light of understanding, an understanding that was now poisoning my own mind. I should have stopped when the first syllable tasted like ash on my tongue, when the temperature plummeted, when I felt the unblinking gaze of something vast and ancient from beyond the void. But I kept reading. I always keep reading. It's what I do. It's who I am. The ritual was complex, labyrinthine, involving precise astronomical alignments, specific geomagnetic fields, and a series of sacrificial rites, not of blood, but of will. The anchor was not a physical place in the conventional sense, but a nexus of spiritual and cosmic energy, a focal point of dread and despair. The location, cryptically described as the place where the river of time flows backward and the hearts of the unfaithful beat loudest, began to coalesce into a chillingly specific image in my mind. The implications of such a sight, its subtle, insidious influence on human suffering, were enough to make my stomach churn. I felt a tightening in my chest, a premonition of unshakable doom. This was no longer an academic exercise. This was the precipice of absolute annihilation. My mind, once a fortress of logical deduction, was now a shattered pane of glass, reflecting 1,000 horrific truths. I could feel the entity, not physically, but as a pressure against my thoughts, an absence of light, a cold indifference that was more terrifying than any active malevolence. It was a cancer on the universe, an anomaly that threatened to unweave the very fabric of existence. And I, the supposed scholar of the forbidden, had just become its unwitting scout, its cartographer. The priests still watched me, their faces unreadable in the gloom, their silence now a deafening roar in my ears. I had walked into a trap, not of their making, but of the cosmos itself, and now there was no escaping the knowledge I carried. The target was not a man, and the horror was not confined to these subterranean halls. It was in my mind, an irreversible infection. I read the final phrase, the one that sealed my fate, the one that offered no solace, only the bitter taste of cosmic irony. Now I am forever connected to that which I uncovered, a vessel for a dread I can never shed. I can still feel the weight of it in my hands, a parchment like no other, thin as vellum yet dense with secrets. Pulled from a recess, I was explicitly forbidden to enter. My fingers tremble even now at the memory of its touch, cold and dry, yet somehow alive. They warned us never to tamper with the sealed archives beneath the Vatican library, especially not the crypt of forgotten codices, the ones whispering of things better left unspoken. But I was arrogant, a scholar hungry for an anomaly, a forgotten truth. I thought I was immune, that my intellect would be a shield against mere superstition. How naive I was to believe any knowledge could be truly inert. That was only the first mistake, the first thread I pulled from a tapestry that would unravel my entire existence. I remember the initial exhilaration, the thrill of holding something so ancient, so utterly other. It wasn't written in any recognizable script, not Latin, Greek, or Hebrew, yet I swore I could feel the meaning radiating from it, a silent hum against my fingertips. I locked myself in my study, the gaslight casting long, dancing shadows, determined to decipher it. The initial characters seemed to morph, shifting subtly when I looked away, only to resolve back into something almost legible upon my return. It was a trick of the light, I told myself, or perhaps the strain on my eyes. But then the whispers began, faint at first, like wind through dry leaves, barely audible above the frantic beating of my own heart. I kept reading, hours blurring into days, my initial academic curiosity curdling into a feverish obsession. The symbols started to take on a terrifying coherence, not as a language I learned, but as a language I remembered from some primal, forgotten part of my being. And that's when it truly began to twist. The letters, when I focused, would rearrange themselves, forming words, phrases, even sentences that spoke directly to me, not about me, but to me. My name, spoken in that dry, rustling whisper, resonated from the very fibers of the parchment. A voice I didn't recognize, yet felt intimately familiar, like a forgotten chord struck deep within my chest. I should have stopped then, should have burned it, sealed it, buried it, but the compulsion was absolute. It was as if the parchment itself had seized my will, drawing me deeper into its malignant embrace, each word a tendril anchoring me to its dark purpose. The whispers grew bolder, not just my name, but fragmented sentences, ancient doctrines, references to rituals performed in shadowed chapels long ago purged from official records. Veritas non liberabit te, it hissed, contradicting every Enlightenment ideal I had ever held dear. A truth that did not free, but bound. It spoke of hierarchies beyond human comprehension, of pacts made in blood and shadowed intentions, of names that, when uttered, did not merely describe but summon. I started seeing patterns in mundane things, the cracks in the ceiling, the swirling condensation on my window pane, the knot of wood in my desk. Everything seemed to mirror the intricate, alien geometry of the parchment. I thought I was imagining it, attributing sentience to an inanimate object, a sign of my exhaustion, until the parchment started to pulse. At first, it was subtle, a faint throb against my palm when I held it, easily dismissed as my own pulse or a trick of tired nerves. But as the days bled into weeks, the pulsing grew stronger, more rhythmic, a slow, deliberate beat that felt utterly separate from my own. It was cold, that pulse, like the rhythmic pumping of frozen ichor. I began to sleep less, consumed by the need to understand, to decode, to master this thing. My dreams became vivid, terrifying landscapes of impossible architecture and hooded figures enacting silent, unspeakable rites. I would wake in a cold sweat, the memory of arcane symbols burned behind my eyelids, their meaning just out of reach, but their terrifying implication clear as day. The parchment lay on my desk, sometimes glowing with a faint, phosphorescent light, mocking my efforts to rest. My academic pursuits, once a source of intellectual pride, became a descent into forgotten blasphemies. I found myself scouring obscure theological texts, Vatican archives, I was only granted access to under strict supervision, searching for any parallel, any echo of the symbols, the names, the rituals described in my forbidden document. I started cross-referencing apocryphal gospels with Gnostic texts, seeking connections between discarded heresies and the dark gospel I held in my hands. The deeper I went, the more I saw how carefully the true history had been suppressed, how thoroughly the knowledge of these entities had been eradicated from common understanding. The Church hadn't merely condemned these things, it had erased them, not because they were false, but because they were terribly, devastatingly real. I isolated myself, avoiding colleagues, canceling lectures, the excuses growing thinner, my appearance growing more disheveled. They asked if I was ill. I lied, saying I was on the cusp of a groundbreaking discovery, which, in a twisted way, I was. But the discovery was me. The discovery was my impending dissolution. The parchment wasn't just showing me hidden knowledge, it was changing me. My perception of reality began to warp. Shadows deepened. Corners of rooms seemed to stretch and shift. And sometimes, just at the periphery of my vision, I would catch glimpses of movement, fleeting shapes, darker than darkness, lingering just out of focus. I'd whip my head around, only to find nothing but empty air, the faint rustle of the parchment, the only sound in the suffocating silence. It was during one particularly intense session, the air in my study thick with the scent of old paper and something metallic, almost like old blood, that I finally understood. The document wasn't a passive text to be read. It was a living, breathing covenant. The words, the symbols, they weren't just information. They were clauses, terms, conditions. The contract it spoke of was not some abstract agreement from a bygone era, but a very real, very present bond. And I, in my blind academic zeal, in my arrogant pursuit of forbidden knowledge, had signed it with every curious glance, every whispered reading, every moment I allowed its tendrils to sink deeper into my mind. I was a signatory, unknowingly, unwittingly, irrevocably. The whispers intensified, no longer just a faint rustle but a cacophony of voices, all speaking my name, all demanding my attention, drawing me in. "Consensisti," they hissed. "I am obligaris. You have consented, now you are bound." The pulsing of the parchment was no longer subtle. It vibrated against the wooden surface of my desk, a rhythmic thrum that resonated through the floorboards, through the very bones of my apartment building. I started to hear it when the parchment wasn't even near, the cold, dry throb echoing in my own chest, a second heart beating beneath my ribs, not my own. I looked at my reflection in the window, seeing not just myself, but a subtle distortion, a deepening of the shadows beneath my eyes, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the light that made my features seem less human. I tried to stop. I tried to put it away, to ignore it, to burn it, but my hands wouldn't obey. My will had fractured. Every attempt to sever myself from it was met with a jolt of pure, icy dread, a visceral pain that seized my lungs and squeezed the breath from me. It wanted to be read, to be understood, but not in the way I understood a book. It wanted to be internalized, to become a part of me, to reshape my reality around its own terrifying truth. The names that summon, the rituals, the shadowy figures, they weren't just descriptions, they were instructions. And I was becoming the vessel, the unwilling instrument through which its ancient, malevolent will would manifest. My world has shrunk to the four walls of this study, illuminated by the cold, pulsing light of the parchment. I can't go out, not really. Every face I see on the street seems to carry a flicker of recognition, a knowing gaze that chills me to the bone. Are they already here? Are they watching? Or is it just the paranoia, the slow erosion of my sanity, carefully engineered by the document? The line between reality and the whispers blurs, shimmers, breaks. I pick up the parchment again, compelled, the dry, cold pulse resonating in my own chest, mirroring the beat that now seems to be my truest, most terrifying heart. The symbols shift, beckoning, demanding. The contract is active, and I am its subject. I should have listened to the warnings, should have left the sealed archives undisturbed. Now, I am merely the custodian of a truth that devours. They told me to erase the name, not just from every ledger, but from my own mind too, as if memory itself wasn't a living thing, a hungry thing, once fed. I remember the chill of the subterranean passages, the air thick with the dust of centuries and the faint, unsettling scent of ozone and something akin to burned parchment. Each step echoed a hollow promise of damnation, a pilgrimage not to salvation, but to a truth so foul it had been buried alive. The old priest, Father Anselm, had met me in a forgotten chamber, his face a roadmap of terror, his breath a ragged whisper. He spoke of death, not as an abstract concept, but as a palpable entity, a spectral thief stealing away souls from the very threshold of absolution. He called it mortiferum cineris, the ash-bearer, claiming it left behind footprints of fine, gray dust in places no man should ever walk. I should have stopped when I first saw the seal on the archives Father Anselm led me to, a sigil not of ecclesiastical authority, but of profound, ancient dread, an inscription etched into basalt that pulsed faintly with a cold, internal light. It wasn't a lock to keep things out, but a barrier to keep things in. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, held a silent plea, a warning that drowned out the Latin blessing he forced upon my forehead. "You seek what must not be known," he'd rasped, his voice barely a breath. "And once known, it seeks you." I didn't realize then that his trembling hands weren't just blessing me. They were marking me for sacrifice. This clandestine vault, nestled deep beneath the Vatican, far from the sacred halls, was where the Church truly kept its secrets. Not the scandals, not the heresies, but the truths that could unravel existence itself. I was sent to find the pattern, the history of this mortiferum cineris, and ultimately, the name that must be permanently expunged from all records, even the most deeply hidden, even if it meant risking my own sanity. But I kept reading, day after day, week after week, the oppressive silence of the vault broken only by the rustle of vellum and the frantic drumming of my own heart. The task was simple, on the surface. Track the documented instances of unexplained disappearances from confessionals, especially those where only an odd, fine ash remained. The early reports, scrawled in monastic script, spoke of a chill that descended with no breeze, a sudden, absolute silence, and then absence. No struggle, no trace of the penitent, save for the ash, and always, always, a faint, bitter scent, like wood smoke mixed with something unholy. The official records, those available to the public, attributed these events to demonic possession, rogue cultists, or outright fabrication. But here, in this suffocating crypt of forgotten truths, the story was different. It spoke of a predator that didn't just kill, but unmade. The archives themselves were a labyrinth of forbidden knowledge, texts bound in human skin, codices illuminated with glyphs that seemed to writhe on the page, forbidden treatises whispered in forgotten tongues. Each tome I pulled from its iron-bound shelf felt like I was disturbing a slumbering god, or perhaps a sleeping demon. I found references to mortiferum cineris, dating back to the late Roman Empire, always appearing when faith was tested, when desperate souls sought absolution for the gravest sins. It was never seen, not truly, only its effects, a shadow that absorbed light, a cold that bit deeper than any frost. The ash was its signature, a residue of what it consumed, not just flesh, but essence, memory, the very idea of a person. It was an existential predator, feeding on the threads that weave us into being. And the name Father Anselm wanted erased? It wasn't a name of a person, but a sequence, a pattern of incantations, a key to its presence, woven into prayers, into curses, into the very structure of certain forbidden liturgies. I thought I was imagining it until the smell of ash, that distinct, acrid scent, began to cling to my clothes, even when I was nowhere near the documents. It permeated the stone, seeped into my skin, became a constant companion. My hands, once clean and steady, now seemed perpetually grimy, dusted with a residue I couldn't wash away. Sleep became a battleground, filled with images of shifting shadows and the echoes of silent screams. The fear wasn't just external. It began to gnaw at my insides, dissolving my resolve. The very act of reading these cursed texts, of trying to understand the entity, was drawing it closer. I was not just a scholar. I was becoming a beacon. I saw glimpses of it in the peripheral vision, a flicker of deeper darkness in the unlit corners of the vault, a momentary distortion in the fabric of the shadows. Later, I would understand that the reason the mission felt so impossible was that mortiferum cineris isn't something one hunts. It's something one attracts. It's a parasite of sorrow, a scavenger of regret, drawn to the very act of seeking absolution. The deeper I delved into the forbidden lore, the more I understood its insidious nature. It wasn't just about the ash footprints. Those were merely the husks, the detritus of what it had devoured. The true horror was the complete obliteration of existence, the erasure from memory, from history, from the very fabric of reality. No one mourned those it took because no one remembered they had ever existed. Their names became unspeakable, not because they were taboo, but because they simply ceased to be. The Church's true struggle wasn't against a demon, but against a void that consumed meaning. The name I was meant to erase was the precise frequency, the resonant phrase, the dark prayer that called it forth, a whisper capable of unraveling existence itself. It was hidden in plain sight, woven into the fabric of despair. The silence deepened, becoming a living thing, pressing in on me, stealing the oxygen from my lungs. The temperature dropped, a sudden, unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from the very air I breathed. My fingers, numb with dread, traced a particularly gruesome, illuminated manuscript depicting figures fading into gray dust, their faces contorted in silent horror. Below the image, in meticulous Latin, was a passage I had overlooked, an incantation for the Ultima Confessio, the last confession. It wasn't a prayer for divine mercy, but an invocation, a suicide note written in the language of damnation, and within it, the sequence of names, words that weren't names at all, but vibrational keys to unlock the maw of the ash-bearer. A shiver, colder than any fear, coursed through me. I didn't realize then that every page turned was another thread binding me to its presence, tightening with each word deciphered. The true horror wasn't in finding the name, but in the sickening realization that I had already read it, absorbed it, allowed it to resonate within me as I sought its meaning. It wasn't just written in the books, it was now written in my mind, a parasitic memory. I tried to speak, to call out, but my throat was tight with an ancient fear, the kind that preceded language itself. My mission to erase the name had merely been the preamble to a far more sinister rite. Father Anselm, with his trembling hands and terrified eyes, hadn't been assigning a task. He had been passing on a curse. He had been a prior bearer, marked for its attention, and now I was the next. The ash, the cold, the creeping sense of unreality. They weren't signs of its proximity, but of its presence within me, feeding on my accumulating dread, on the knowledge I had so eagerly consumed. I felt it then, not as a physical touch, but as a profound emptiness, a vacuum that sucked the very warmth from my soul. A whisper, not heard with my ears, but with the very core of my being, echoed the sequence of names I had just read. It wasn't hunting me. It had already found me, centuries ago, etched into the very words I was now reading, waiting for the curious, the desperate, the foolish, to summon it through understanding. The flickering oil lamps in the vault seemed to dim, swallowing the shadows whole, leaving only the oppressive, suffocating darkness. The ash on my skin wasn't just residue. It was the process of my own erasure beginning, turning me into a memory that no one would ever recall. I can't escape what I've learned, because what I've learned has become part of me, a part it has now come to claim. I remember the dust. It wasn't the inert, settled dust of a forgotten attic, but a living, ancient particulate that seemed to cling to my very breath, coating my tongue with the taste of millennia. The false wall, disguised by a meticulously arranged grid of tarnished silver rosaries and bound volumes of early church doctrine, was a masterpiece of deceit. It wasn't merely hidden, it was obfuscated, meant to appear part of the established, sacred decay of the Vatican's deeper archives, yet it hummed with an almost imperceptible chill, a whisper of something far older than any pontifical decree. My fingers, calloused from years of deciphering brittle manuscripts, traced the cold, damp stone, and even then, before the first loose brick gave way, a prickle of unease snaked down my spine. This is not merely a secret, I remember thinking. This is a containment. And I should have stopped when that thought first formed. A warning bell tolling in the silent, musty air. But the lure of the unknown, the insatiable academic hunger for the unrecorded truth, was a siren's song I was ill-equipped to resist. Each shift of mortar, each scraped knuckle, only fueled my resolve. The first brick, then another, revealed not bedrock, but a deeper, blacker void. The air that seeped from the gap was heavy, stale, and smelled not of earth, but of dried blood and forgotten incense. A scent that now, retrospectively, makes my gorge rise. What kind of knowledge required such a meticulously constructed tomb? What power lay buried so deep that its mere concealment demanded such devotion from generations of custodians? I didn't realize then that the questions I sought to answer would become the chains that bind me now. The stairwell was crude, hewn directly from the living rock, each step worn smooth not by time, but by a consistent, almost ritualistic descent. There was no light down there, no torch sconce, only an absolute, crushing blackness that swallowed the beam of my headlamp, refusing to reflect it. As I descended, the silence intensified, becoming a physical presence that pressed against my ears, a profound vacuum devoid of the usual creaks and groans of an ancient building. That's when I first heard it, a faint, rhythmic shuffle, a slow, deliberate cadence that echoed my own steps, yet was subtly, unnervingly, out of sync. It was as if another, unseen presence walked behind me, mirroring my movements, yet perpetually falling a fraction of a second behind. I paused, heart hammering against my ribs, convinced it was merely an acoustic anomaly, a trick of the deep, oppressive quiet. But when I moved again, so did it. The library at the bottom was not a grand chamber, but a vast, sprawling cavern, its walls lined with shelves carved directly from the subterranean rock. Thousands of volumes, not bound in leather or vellum, but in some unknown, leathery hide, pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence that barely illuminated the suffocating darkness. They lay there, stacked in impossible configurations, some chained to the shelves with heavy rusted iron, others splayed open on lecterns of obsidian, their pages covered in scripts I had never encountered in my extensive studies of dead languages. It wasn't just a library, it was a mausoleum of thought, a repository of concepts so inimical to human understanding that they had been buried alive, still breathing. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, and something sweet, cloying, like putrefying lilies, and the collective rustle of countless pages, a faint, papery sigh, filled the space. It was the sound of slumbering animals, vast and ancient, stirring in their sleep. My academic curiosity, once a disciplined pursuit, morphed into a feverish obsession. My fingers brushed the spines, each one radiating a cold, alien energy. Some of the volumes were not books at all, but slabs of polished bone, etched with intricate, repetitive sigils that seemed to shift and writhe at the periphery of my vision. I chose one, a heavy tome bound in what felt like dried, flayed skin, its cover unmarked save for a single, deeply carved glyph, a spiraling vortex that seemed to draw the ambient light into its center. As I opened it, the pages groaned, a sound like dry lungs expanding, and the faint, out-of-sync footsteps from the stairwell seemed to grow louder, closer, now almost directly behind me, a phantom companion in this sacred, blasphemous space. The language inside was a horrifying tapestry of forgotten tongues, interwoven with geometric patterns and impossible anatomical diagrams. There were names, sequences of syllables that vibrated with an unholy resonance, promising power or utter annihilation. I transcribed what I could, my pen scratching furiously on my notepad, feeling the knowledge seep into my very bones, corrupting the rational structures of my mind. These were not mere incantations. They were pathways, invitations, blueprints for realities that should remain forever sealed. Nomen est omen, the old adage whispers, but here, the name was the thing, a direct conduit, and with each character I copied, each forbidden concept I grasped, a cold, hard knot of fear tightened in my gut. I thought I was simply documenting a lost civilization's cosmology until I recognized a pattern, a recurring motif that linked seemingly disparate texts, a ritual, chillingly specific, for the severance of the veil between worlds, a desperate plea to entities beyond human comprehension. The footsteps were no longer out of sync. They were perfectly synchronized with my own, a terrifying echo that confirmed I was no longer alone. I spun around, my headlamp beam cutting through the gloom, but there was nothing. Only the endless shelves, the whispering pages, the oppressive, breathing darkness. Yet the sound persisted, not just an echo, but a presence that moved when I moved, stopped when I stopped, always just behind me, just out of sight. A cold sweat slicked my skin, my heart now a drum against my ribs. I was being watched, observed, perhaps even accompanied. This wasn't just a secret library. It was a crucible, and I was the subject of its terrifying experiment. What had I awakened? I kept reading, compelled by a force beyond my own will, my eyes devouring the meticulously drawn constellations of alien stars, the diagrams of grotesque, multi-limbed beings, the equations that spoke of dimensions folded back upon themselves. My academic curiosity had curdled into a manic desperation, a terrifying compulsion to understand the entire blasphemous canon, to absorb every last shred of its unholy wisdom. The air grew colder, heavy with a pressure that squeezed my lungs, making it difficult to breathe. The faint luminescence of the books intensified, casting long, wavering shadows that danced like phantoms along the cavern walls. I began to see things in the periphery of my vision, shapes that coalesced from the darkness, only to dissolve when I turned to face them. Whispers, not from the pages, but from the very stone, snaked into my ears, not in any language I knew, but in a dissonant harmony that frayed the edges of my sanity. My hands trembled as I turned a page depicting a procession of robed figures, their faces obscured by deep hoods. Performing a ritual I now understood was the core of this entire forbidden collection. It was a mass, an inversion of sacred rites, designed to open a gate not to the divine, but to the infernal. The sigils carved into the cavern walls around me, I now realized, were not decorative, but part of this very ritual, amplifying the texts, making the entire space a monstrous altar. The breathing of the books, the whispers, the footsteps, they were not external phenomena, they were the effect of this place, reacting to my presence, responding to my proximity, to the forbidden knowledge. I wasn't just reading about a ritual, I was performing it by my very act of engagement, by allowing my mind to grasp its contours. I was the key, turning in the lock. Panic, cold and absolute, finally seized me. I stumbled backwards, tearing my gaze from the pages, the weight of 1,000 unspeakable truths pressing down on me. The footsteps behind me stopped, but the overwhelming sense of presence remained, a suffocating blanket of unseen eyes. I had read too much, seen too much, understood too much. The gate was no longer theoretical. It felt ajar, a sliver of impossible blackness bleeding into my reality. I fled, scrambling back up the crude, ancient steps, ignoring the burning in my lungs, the frantic drumming of my heart. The cold seemed to chase me, a palpable entity. As I sealed the false wall behind me, resecuring the rosaries and the chained scripture, the silence that followed was not a relief, but a deeper, more profound dread. The archives above, once a sanctuary of ordered knowledge, now felt like a fragile shell, barely containing the abyss I had unleashed. The echoes of those footsteps, out of sync and then perfectly matched, still follow me. They are no longer in the physical world, they are inside my skull, a constant reminder of the unseen companion I invited into my existence. I carry the abyss within me now, a part of its horrifying truth imprinted on my soul. I have opened a door that should have remained eternally sealed, and now I feel its cold breath on my neck, forever. I remember the exact moment the membrane of reality thinned, not with a sudden tear, but a slow, insidious seep, like a poison permeating through permeable skin. It began when I ignored the primordial instinct screaming at me to recoil, to drop the volume and run. The binding, disturbingly supple, seemed to pulse faintly under my fingertips, a sensation I later learned was not merely leather, but something far more organic and recently living. I should have stopped when the first script unfurled before my eyes, an archaic dialect of Latin interwoven with glyphs I recognized only from sketches in the darkest corners of Vatican archives, texts marked Damnati Memoriae, destined for absolute obliteration, not mere obscurity. But I kept reading, drawn in by an invisible current, a morbid curiosity that tasted of both revelation and damnation. The initial passages were dense, esoteric theological treatises on duality, on the inherent opposition within all creation. But then, the tone shifted, growing sharper, more personal. It spoke of an anima gemina, a twin born not of flesh, but of spirit, a shadow self mirroring one's existence. Not a mere psychological construct, mind you, but a distinct entity, conjured into being at the very second of one's earthly arrival. In the hour of Genesis, the text declared, the vessel is prepared, and its counter-vessel, forged from the lingering breath of the unmade, is tethered. This was the first open loop, a mystery that tugged at the very fabric of my understanding of self. Who was this twin? Why had I never known? My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a percussive accompaniment to the unraveling of everything I believed. Then came the more terrifying revelation, nestled within a description of an ancient order, an Ordo Custos Mortem, the keepers against death, if my translation was accurate. These were not mere priests, but guardians of a primal balance, operating under the absolute secrecy of the highest echelons of the Curia, their existence purged from all official records. The Codex, clearly a splinter from their own forbidden lore, detailed their ultimate enemy, not death itself, but an encroaching entity that sought to pervert death, to transform it from an end into an instrument of ceaseless torment. And to combat this, the Codex stated, an instrument had to be fashioned, a living weapon. Death may only be undone by that which it has touched, yet cannot claim, the brittle pages whispered. The words began to coalesce into a chilling prophecy, a foreboding about a specific type of birth, a specific kind of soul. I thought I was imagining it, the way the ink seemed to deepen, to gain dimension, until the page almost vibrated with a faint, low hum. The text elaborated on the methods of this secret order, describing rituals performed under specific lunar cycles, involving names of power that could summon or bind. These were not the common demonological incantations found in grimoires, but names derived from ancient pre-Christian sources, languages that predated human speech, echoing primordial screams of creation and destruction. The Codex referred to them as the nomina interdicta, the forbidden names. Speaking them, even reading them, felt like treading on hallowed yet cursed ground. Each syllable seemed to echo in the hollows of my mind, not just as sound, but as an oppressive presence. I found myself whispering one, almost involuntarily, a name like a guttural sigh, and the air around me seemed to thicken, the room's temperature dropping several degrees. It was a visceral, undeniable reaction, and it solidified a second terrifying open loop. What power did these names truly hold, and what had I just unleashed, even in a whisper? I should have stopped when my reflection in the dark, polished surface of the antique desk seemed to shift, just a flicker, a momentary distortion that was not my own movement. But I kept reading, compelled by an obsession that felt less like my own will, and more like a directive being etched into my very soul. The Codex began to speak of a unique birth, one occurring under a rare celestial alignment, destined to produce an individual whose existence was intrinsically linked to this struggle. This individual, born with an echo of the anima gemina already attuned, was designated the harbinger of the unmaking, the one sent to rebalance, to hunt the perversion of death. My hands trembled, the parchment rustling like dry bones. I didn't realize then that the book wasn't merely describing a historical account or an ancient prophecy. It was detailing my destiny, my birthright. That was only the first mistake, assuming it was separate from me. The pages grew increasingly frantic, detailing the psychological toll on those who bore this burden, the constant erosion of self, the blurring of perception as the shadow self, the anima gemina, grew stronger, fed by the forbidden knowledge. Paranoia, the text warned, was not a symptom but a natural state. For the enemy, the mors corruptus, was shapeless, ubiquitous, and utterly insidious. It could wear any face, inhabit any form. Later I would understand that this wasn't just abstract philosophy. It was a manual for survival, or rather, a chilling pre-mortem analysis of my own impending unraveling. The shadows in the corners of my room seemed to deepen, coalesce, and for a fleeting moment, I saw movement, a periphery flicker that vanished when I turned my head directly. Was it my exhaustion, or was something else beginning to stir, awakened by the words I consumed? The Codex did not end with a triumphant climax or a clear path to victory. Instead, it dissolved into a series of fragmented warnings, cryptic diagrams, and what appeared to be personal annotations by previous, terrified readers. They hunt us through our own reflections. One scrawled margin read, "The ink faded and smeared as if by a trembling hand." Another simply stated, in a script that seemed to claw at the page, "The mirror is the gate. Do not trust what blinks first." This was the horrifying truth, slowly dawning on me, the true purpose of the book. It wasn't just a historical document, it was a curse, a key, an awakening. I was not merely an observer of ancient secrets. I had become a participant, my own genesis, a focal point in a cosmic horror I was never meant to comprehend. The paranoia intensified, a cold, clinical dread that settled deep in my bones. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, became a potential harbinger. The final pages, a tapestry of faded prophecies, spoke directly of the celestial alignment of my birth, describing the very year, month, and even the precise planetary conjunction. It detailed the faint birthmark-like scar that would appear on the harbinger's wrist, a mark I had always dismissed as a trivial imperfection, but now recognized with a sickening lurch as a glyph, an arcane symbol. The full weight of the prophecy crashed down upon me then, a suffocating realization. I was not just reading about this harbinger, I was the harbinger. My life, my very existence, was not my own, but a preordained tool in a war I had unknowingly been born into. The knowledge, a living parasite in my mind, burrowed deep, twisting my perception of reality, forcing me to question every memory, every interaction, every fleeting shadow. The world, once mundane, now teemed with unseen enemies, with the omnipresent threat of the Mors Corruptus lurking just beyond my peripheral vision, just outside the radius of my sanity. The Codex didn't offer a means of escape, only a confirmation of my inescapable role and a grim forecast of the battle to come. It was a mirror reflecting a monstrous destiny, one where my own face, my own identity, was destined to become the ultimate weapon or the ultimate casualty. The lines between what was me and what was the ancient text began to blur completely. I could feel the cold, detached logic of the Ordo Custos Mortem seeping into my thoughts, hear the silent, desperate pleas of the past readers echoing in my skull. I was no longer just the person who found the book. I was becoming an extension of its horrifying truth, a vessel for its ancient, terrible purpose. The sound of my own breathing became alien, an intrusion in the suddenly too quiet room. Now, as the words have faded from the page but etched themselves into my soul, I find myself constantly checking my reflection, not for vanity, but for that telltale blink, that subtle shift, that definitive sign that the shadow self is real, and it is here, and it is waiting. I wish I could unread it, unlearn it, rip the knowledge from my mind, but it's too late. The book has become me, and I have become its prophecy. I should never have found the passage behind the false reliquary, never touched the vellum that crumbled like burnt skin under my gloved fingers, revealing glyphs that twisted the eye. My hunger for the hidden histories, for the lex non scripta buried beneath centuries of dogma, had become an insatiable parasite, gnawing at the edges of my reason. Now, standing on the threshold of this hidden chapel, the air itself feels like a memory, cold, still, burdened by an unspoken weight. Every instinct screams at me to turn back, to seal the passage and forget what I've seen. But the same impulse that drove me through the Vatican's most guarded, forgotten corridors now compels me forward. A moth drawn to a flame I know will incinerate me. The anathema of the forbidden texts, the whispers of the Codex Obscura that spoke of places outside time, they were not mere fables, they were blueprints. I didn't realize then that the stillness was not reverence but a cosmic paralysis, a held breath before the scream. The chapel is a tableau of arrested decay. Candles, thick with ancient wax, hang frozen mid-drip, their wicks petrified, black and unburnt. Dust motes, suspended in the single shaft of moonlight piercing a high, grimy window, refuse to descend, caught in an invisible amber. It's an impossible stillness, a silence so profound it presses against my eardrums, threatening to burst them. My breath, shallow and ragged, feels sacrilegious in this sacred, petrified space. The air is heavy with the scent of ozone and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood mixed with iron. I thought I was imagining it until a shiver, cold and alien, traced a path directly over my heart, a sensation utterly devoid of my own physiology. At the altar, a figure kneels, hooded, motionless. It is draped in robes so dark they seem to absorb the meager light, creating a void in the room's already deep shadows. It faces away from me, towards an altar devoid of crucifix or saint, instead adorned with an arrangement of black, polished stones, each pulsating with a faint, internal luminescence that is almost imperceptible. What truly roots me, What transforms my academic curiosity into a primordial dread is the breathing. It's a rhythmic, wet rasp, too deep, too full, too many breaths for a single human chest. It sounds like a chorus of collapsing lungs, a slow, sustained exhalation that vibrates through the very floor beneath my feet, resonating not just in the air, but in my bones. I am no longer an observer. I am part of its perceived reality. A cold sweat breaks across my brow, prickling my scalp. My hand instinctively clutches the small iron crucifix I always carry, a habit born more from superstition than faith, but it feels utterly useless here, an anachronism against this ancient, unholy presence. I should have stopped when the breathing intensified, a subtle shift in its impossible rhythm, as if the figure had just become aware of my intrusion, even though I had made no sound. But I kept approaching, drawn by a morbid fascination, a perverse need to understand what blasphemy could exist in a place so deeply hidden, so painstakingly preserved outside the currents of time. The light from the moonbeam, once my only comfort, now feels like a spotlight, marking me for its attention. The figure does not move, not even a twitch of the shoulder, yet I feel its gaze, a palpable weight on my back, cold and knowing. The air grows heavier, the ozone more pungent. The rhythmic, multiple breaths begin to coalesce into a single, sustained hum, a low thrum that seems to vibrate inside my skull, resonating with something deep within my own subconscious, an echo of a forgotten melody. This is not the quiet sanctity of a hidden shrine. This is a snare, meticulously laid, and I have walked directly into its center, following the thread of obscure theological tracts and fragmented Latin phrases from a Vatican archive that should have remained sealed for eternity. Then it whispers, not loud, not sharp, but a dry, sibilant sound, like sand shifting on desert winds, or ancient parchment decaying to dust. The words are not Latin, not Greek, nor any language I've ever deciphered from the countless forbidden texts I've obsessively studied. Not even the dead tongues rumored to summon things from the spaces between stars. Yet, I understand them. Worse, I know them. Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, ever this day, be at my side, to light and guard, to rule and guide. It's the evening prayer, the one my grandmother taught me, the one I whispered into the darkness of my childhood room, a unique, personalized version, slightly altered from the standard liturgy, a secret between me and the night. My blood turns to ice, then to fire, then back to ice again, chilling me to the marrow. How could it know? How could anything in this frozen, ancient crypt, this place outside of time, know the intimate secrets of my childhood, prayers spoken in a room thousands of miles and decades away? My academic mind, trained to dissect, to rationalize, to categorize, shatters. This isn't scholarship. This is an intrusion into the very fabric of my being, an unholy violation. I should have fled when it whispered the prayer I said as a child, when it proved it had not only observed but entered my personal history. But I kept approaching, certain I was stalking death itself, not realizing I was merely stepping into its open maw. A subtle shift in the shadows at the figure's feet draws my eye. They writhe, not with movement, but with a deeper, internal pulse, like something alive yet formless. It is as if the very darkness in the chapel has achieved sentience, a consciousness that mirrors the glyphs I'd seen in the forbidden books, the ones that spoke of nomen est omen, the name as destiny, the name as a binding force. My research had hinted at entities called forth not by complex sigils, but by the utterance of true names, personal, intimate appellations whispered into the ether, unknowingly by those who sought solace. The prayer, my prayer, suddenly takes on a horrifying new context, a summoning I performed unwittingly, year after year. The black stones on the altar glow brighter now, a faint, sickly green emanating from their depths, casting long, distorted shadows that dance across the chapel walls. The hooded figure remains perfectly still, but the breathing, the multitude of lungs, ceases. In its place, a high-pitched, almost imperceptible hum begins, a sound that vibrates not just in my bones but in the very core of my soul, stirring ancient, buried fears. It's a sound that promises revelation, but at a cost far greater than any scholar should ever pay. This is the truth the Vatican has fought for centuries to bury. The knowledge contained in the most heavily redacted pages of the Liber Malorum. The understanding that some prayers are not pleas for protection, but invocations. I thought I was imagining it until the green light pulsed in sync with the phantom hum, and the shadows around the figure began to coalesce, mirroring the shapes of the glyphs from the forbidden texts, now appearing in spectral form on the chapel walls, shimmering and then fading. Each pulse feels like a hammer blow to my sanity, chipping away at the carefully constructed walls of my intellect. The words of the chapel's title echo in my mind. Candles hung frozen mid-flicker, and dust refused to fall. This wasn't just a physical phenomenon. It was a symptom of something far grander, a temporal anomaly, a locus where the veil between worlds thinned to nothing. My vision blurs, not from tears or exhaustion, but from a profound disorientation, a sense that my perception itself is being warped, stretched thin by an unseen force. The figure at the altar is no longer merely a figure. It is the focal point of an immense, silent power, a conduit for something that has existed since before humanity uttered its first word. The whispered prayer, my childhood prayer, now feels like a brand, irrevocably seared into my very essence, marking me as one who has gazed into the abyss and found it gazing back with an unnerving, intimate knowledge. I am not simply observing a ritual. I am part of it, an unwilling, terrified participant in a cosmic liturgy. My body aches with a desperate primal urge to flee, to scream, but my muscles refuse to obey, locked in place by an invisible terror. The knowledge I sought, the conspiracies I unearthed, the forbidden names I meticulously cross-referenced, they were never meant to grant insight, but to entrap. This creature at the altar, or whatever it is, did not simply know my prayer. It had been listening. It had been waiting. And now, I am here, standing before it, a victim of my own insatiable curiosity, my own fatal hubris. The hum intensifies, becoming a silent shriek within my mind, tearing at the fabric of my sanity. The green light flares, briefly illuminating the figure, just enough to reveal that beneath the cowl, there is no face, only a deeper, more profound darkness. The silence that follows is not a relief, but a heavier burden, a pregnant pause before an inevitable final horror. I am caught, trapped in a frozen moment that will stretch into an eternity, bound by a knowledge I was never meant to possess, and by a name I never realized I had invoked. Now, I understand that escaping the chapel meant nothing if I had already brought it out into the world, if it had already imprinted itself upon my soul. I broke a sacred trust the moment my fingers brushed the Codex Umbrae, a relic whispered about only in certain, very hushed circles within the Vatican's most inaccessible catacombs. It wasn't just a book, it was a scar on the fabric of creation, a primal scream bound in human skin, its pages a tapestry woven with truths no sane mind was meant to comprehend. I see its obsidian binding in my dreams now, the silver clasps corroded not by time, but by something more corrosive, something that eats at the soul. I should have stopped when the chill of the archive, usually a comfort, turned to an unnatural frost clinging to my very marrow. But I kept reading. I always keep reading. The scripts inside were a madness, a kaleidoscopic swirl of forgotten tongues, interspersed with Latin too ancient to be familiar, and symbols that seemed to writhe on the parchment, demanding a specific kind of internal utterance. It spoke of cycles, of beginnings before the beginning, of entities that predated concept itself, existing in the yawning chasms between stars. It wasn't the traditional heresy I was accustomed to cataloging. This was something far more insidious, something that didn't just challenge dogma, but rendered it a child's fable. I remember the scent of the pages, a sickeningly sweet musk that clung to my clothes for days, an odor of old blood and forgotten divinity. The first hint of true danger came when I cross-referenced a series of recurring glyphs with an obscure Alexandrian text, a fragmented Coptic manuscript I dismissed as an isolated Gnostic eccentricity. The Codex Umbrae not only completed the sequences but imbued them with a profound, terrifying significance. It spoke of the true firstborn, not as a figure, but as an event, a schism in primordial existence that echoed through all subsequent creation. What did it mean by a primordial echo? I spent weeks in that cold, silent crypt, chasing shadows through illuminated script, my academic curiosity morphing into a gnawing obsession, ignoring the persistent ache behind my eyes. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Every time I closed my eyes, the glyphs would swim behind my eyelids, rearranging themselves into patterns that seemed to pulse with a low, inaudible hum. I started seeing them in the intricate carvings of the chapel ceiling, in the random cracks of the ancient marble floor. My colleagues, if they noticed my deteriorating state, attributed it to overwork, the usual price of delving into the more esoteric archives. They didn't know I was no longer cataloging forbidden knowledge. I was absorbing it, letting it rewire the very pathways of my perception. I thought I was imagining it until the whispers began, faint at first, like wind through dry leaves, but growing clearer, coalescing into coherent phrases that seemed to emanate directly from the codex itself, even when it was closed. The book wasn't a repository of information, it was a conduit. It outlined, with chilling precision, the ritual of recognition. Not a summoning of a deity, nor an invocation of a demon, but a specific mode of understanding that allowed one to perceive what was already there, hidden just beyond the veil of mundane reality. It required no arcane ingredients, no blood sacrifices, only a complete dismantling of self, an intellectual and spiritual surrender to the true firstborn. The text hinted at a great betrayal, a cosmic lie perpetuated by the very entities we revered as divine. The Vatican, I realized, wasn't just hiding these books. They were quarantining a truth that would unravel humanity's understanding of its own genesis. That was only the first mistake. The specific sequence of thoughts, the internal mantra that the Codex elucidated, felt less like a prayer and more like a mental alignment, a key turning in a lock I didn't even know existed within my own mind. I spoke the names aloud, the forbidden sounds that resonated in the deepest parts of my skull, not Latin, not Greek, but something older, guttural, resonating with a primeval power. Akashna, Umbra Eterna, Kion Thar. Each syllable was a shard of ice, carving pathways through my consciousness. I didn't realize then that these weren't merely names, but anchors, invitations. The air in my study grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The lamplight, usually a warm glow, seemed to dim, swallowed by a growing void in the periphery of my vision. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I felt a cold dread, a profound terror that wasn't merely fear of death, but fear of absolute annihilation of self. A silence fell, deeper than any I had ever known, a silence that hummed with immense power. It pressed down on me, stealing my breath, freezing the blood in my veins. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return. Then, the shadows in the corner of my cluttered study congealed, not solidifying, but deepening, becoming a space that was more than just an absence of light. It pulsed. A shape emerged, coalescing from the very darkness itself, indistinct at first, like a figure seen through rippling water, yet undeniably present. It moved with an impossible grace, fluid and unhurried. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. My body was locked in a paralysis born of pure terror, my eyes wide, unable to tear away from the nascent form. And then it turned, slowly, deliberately, and I stared into my own eyes, older, hollower, carved by millennia. They were my eyes, yet not mine. They held a suffering, a knowledge, a cosmic weariness that my mortal frame could never endure. The figure was a mirror, a twisted reflection, yet undeniably me. It greeted me, not with words spoken by a mouth, but with a thought, a resonance that echoed directly in the empty spaces of my mind, a welcome, like a long-awaited sibling returned from a journey too vast to comprehend. It claimed we shared an origin, a primal genesis that no priest, no scripture, no human theology would ever confess. Its voice, or rather its mind voice, was a perfect timbre of my own, but deeper, resonating with an ancient authority. I should have denied it. I should have shattered the mirror, screamed heresy, invoked every protective prayer known to man. But I couldn't. I kept listening. The truths it whispered, the revelations it implanted directly into my consciousness, were horrific, yet undeniably logical. They filled the voids in my understanding, explained the mysteries I had always sought, and in doing so, stripped away every comforting lie I had ever believed about reality, about God, about myself. The more it spoke, the more its voice sounded like my own, a chilling internal monologue that twisted my identity, grafting its ancient sorrow onto my very soul. Now, the world feels thin, a mere facade over the screaming void. The Vatican guards its archives not from curious scholars, but from the echoes that escape, the truths that breach the fragile walls of our reality. They are not keepers of faith, but jailers, desperately trying to contain a primordial truth that would annihilate human sanity. I walk among them, a secret burden, a vessel now connected to something ancient and unspeakable, haunted by a reflection that is both me and utterly alien. The knowledge burns, an unholy fire in my mind, and I know now why they call certain texts forbidden, because once you understand, you can never truly unknow. I am irrevocably linked, a puppet on strings woven from cosmic dread, and I feel the shadow of its patient gaze always upon me, waiting for me to fully embrace the terrifying lineage it has unveiled. I still taste the dust of the Vatican archives, a bitter, metallic tang of ancient secrets clinging to my tongue. It wasn't merely the dust of neglect, but the residue of forgotten prayers and unholy rites, a miasma that seemed to permeate the very fabric of existence in those forbidden depths. I swore I'd never look again, never touch anything that smelled of their hidden truths. But then I remember the parchment, the one I clutched even as death recoiled. It wasn't from my foolish blade, a cold, ineffective comfort against its gaze, but from the words unfurling themselves across the brittle surface of that infernal document. That was the precise moment the true damnation began, the turning point where I chose morbid curiosity over basic survival, a choice I relive 1,000 times in the sleepless dark that now defines my existence. I should have stopped when the first syllable whispered from the parchment, a sound like dry leaves skittering across forgotten flagstones, a language I'd never studied, yet understood with a visceral, primal dread that resonated deep within my bone. It felt like a profound sacrilege just to hold it, a brazen violation of every sanctity I had ever known or believed in. I had faced down the spectral guardian, the very embodiment of endings and finality. But this mere piece of paper held a power far more insidious, more corrupting. Its texture, initially like dried, ancient vellum, softened and then began to pulse with a faint, sickly green light emanating from within its very fibers. My fingers, once so adept at deciphering the most obscure of ancient scripts, now felt burned by the very act of contact, as if I were cradling a live ember ripped directly from the inferno itself. But I kept unfolding it, the morbid fascination a cold, implacable vice tightening its grip around my will. Each crease, each minute fold I meticulously smoothed, revealed more of the self-writing text. It wasn't merely appearing, it was birthing itself onto the surface, new lines of ink blooming like dark, parasitic fungi on a festering corpse, filling the blank spaces, colonizing the margins, devouring all emptiness. The whispers grew in intensity, a cacophony now, a relentless choir of damned voices speaking in a dozen forgotten tongues that clawed relentlessly at the fragile periphery of my sanity. Adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua. Except these were not the hallowed words of grace. They were perverse distortions, echoing from an abyssal outer darkness. I thought I was merely imagining it, a trick of the exhausted mind, until the parchment began to vibrate, a low, ominous thrum against my palm, syncing with the frantic, terrified beat of my own heart. It was demanding my absolute attention, no longer requesting but commanding it with an undeniable force. This wasn't just an artifact, a dusty relic of a bygone age. It was an entity, a living, breathing testament to forbidden knowledge, its malevolent will, palpable. Its genesis was utterly unknown, its purpose utterly terrifying in its implications. I remember the icy chill that traced its way down my spine, not from the tomb-like air of the archive, but from the dawning, horrifying realization that this scroll was not merely recording history. It was writing it, actively, with me as its unwilling, unwitting scribe. The text itself shifted, a horrifying palimpsest of damned souls, layered upon layers of archaic scripts, Proto-Sumerian cuneiform melting into forgotten Phoenician glyphs, then into Gothic uncials, all of them flowing into one another, coalescing into a grotesque tapestry of terror and blasphemy. Each language, once dead for millennia, was now vibrant, alive, screaming its insidious, soul-shattering message directly into the most secret chambers of my mind. I should have thrown the contract into the chapel's eternal flames, those consecrated fires meant to cleanse the very air of sin, to purify the lingering stench of damnation that clung to such items. They burned ceaselessly, a luminous sentinel against the encroaching darkness, a beacon of purity. Yet I stood there, paralyzed, mesmerized by the unfolding horror in my hands. The whispers, at first disjointed and alien, began to coalesce, to form coherent, chilling commands. They spoke of the old covenant, not the one humanity knew, but a darker, primordial pact, drawn up before stars had ignited, before light had ever banished the primal, churning void. They spoke insistently of sacrifice. This was the first open loop, the first profound mystery, the first gaping wound in my soul. What sacrifice, exactly, and to whom, to what incomprehensible entity, was it to be offered? I didn't realize then that the very act of asking these questions, of seeking answers, was itself part of the cunning trap, drawing me ever deeper into its inescapable web. The details that emerged were not merely historical records to be catalogued. They were precise blueprints for acts of unimaginable blasphemy, carefully transcribed. Names appeared, names I had only ever encountered in the most heavily redacted, fear-inducing sections of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. Names whispered only by the truly mad in the deepest cells of forgotten asylums. Azazel, Belial, Lilith. These were not mere demons, easily dismissed folkloric entities. They were primeval forces, titanic entities whose very mention, whose very thought, was a powerful summons, a violent tearing of the veil between worlds. I felt a cold phantom breath on my neck, though no one else was present in that forbidden chamber. It was as if the very air itself grew thin, stretched taut and brittle by the sheer, crushing weight of their invoked presence, conjured by the parchment's relentless, self-generating script. The silence that followed was worse, far worse, than any scream, pregnant with the terrifying potential for unspeakable things to manifest. The document wasn't just a contract to be signed and filed. It was a living ritual, activating itself with every word I consumed, with every line I registered. The lines that demanded a sacrifice were not vague. They were sickeningly specific in their requirements. Not gold, not trinkets, not even blood in the common, carnal sense, but something far more intimate, far more precious, a currency of the soul. Memoria vestra, your memory. Anima vestra, your soul. It wasn't about a single, dramatic act, but a protracted series of unending forfeitures. A slow, agonizing erosion of self, a methodical unmaking of who I was. My mind, once a fortress of logical thought and academic discipline, began to fray at the edges, assailed by the constant, piercing mental invasion of the whispers, the flickering, grotesque visions of shadows dancing just beyond my peripheral sight. I thought I was imagining it, succumbing to the stress, until the archivist's lantern, which had hung steady and undisturbed for centuries, flickered once, twice, and then extinguished itself with a soft hiss, plunging me into absolute, suffocating darkness. Blind, save for the sickly, insistent green glow of the parchment that pulsed in my hands, I was truly alone, utterly isolated with the thing. The whispers sharpened, coalescing now into a single dominant voice that resonated deep within my very bone marrow, a vibration that threatened to shatter my teeth. It wasn't a voice I heard with my physical ears, but one that resonated directly in my consciousness, overriding my own thoughts, colonizing my inner monologue. It promised power beyond imagination, knowledge of cosmic significance, dominion over the very laws of reality itself, but always at a cost that transcended mere life. It spoke of forgotten keys to locked gates, of hidden pathways to realms beyond human comprehension, beyond human sanity. It spoke of a profound purpose, a grand, horrifying design that I, the skeptic, the rational scholar, was destined to fulfill. The irony of it all was a bitter gall in my mouth, burning my throat. My academic rigor, my relentless pursuit of objective truth, had only led me directly to this precipice of ultimate, irreversible despair. The sheer volume of information being violently forced into my mind was utterly overwhelming, crushing my mental faculties. Not just words, but vivid, terrifying images. Fleeting glimpses of sprawling, cyclopean cities built from black, impossibly smooth stone beneath crimson, storm-racked skies, of monstrous forms moving with blasphemous, unnatural grace, of shadowy rituals performed by cowled figures in caverns deep beneath the earth. In places no light had ever touched, these weren't mere dreams or hallucinations. They were memories, imprinted directly onto my consciousness, becoming my memories, utterly indistinguishable from my own past. I felt myself slipping, my identity dissolving under the relentless psychic assault. Later I would understand that this was the initial payment, the first forfeiture of self, the first act of sacrifice demanded by the parchment. It wasn't just an agreement, it was a parasitic symbiotic relationship, and I, unwillingly, was the host. I stumbled back, convulsing, dropping the parchment as if it were a burning molten coal. But it didn't fall. It hovered eerily in the air, unfurling completely now, a scroll several meters long, glowing brighter, the whispers crescendoing into a deafening, skull-splitting roar that vibrated through my very teeth. It was an entity unto itself, a living, breathing testament to cosmic horror, its demands now visible in fiery, impossible script that burned itself into my retinas, searing my vision. The initial mystery of death's recognition, suddenly clarified with sickening, gut-wrenching certainty. It hadn't recoiled from me, from my pathetic human attempts at defiance, but from the contract itself. It recognized the binding power, the ultimate, terrifying authority of the entity that stood behind this dreadful, living document. And I, by unfolding it, by reading it, by allowing it to speak to me, had become irrevocably linked to it, a signatory without conscious consent, bound eternally. The pact was sealed not with blood, not with ink, but with curiosity, with the irresistible, fatal urge to know what lay beyond the veil. Beyond the carefully constructed boundaries of human understanding, my thirst for knowledge, once my greatest strength, my guiding star, was now my gravest weakness, meticulously exploited by this ancient, malevolent intelligence. The parchment pulsed, its glow now illuminating the truly shadowed corners of the archive, revealing grotesque carvings on the ancient shelves I had never noticed before, faces twisted in eternal agony, eyes wide with incomprehensible terror, all silently screaming their unending torment. I wasn't just observing a relic anymore. I was part of its active manifestation, drawn inextricably into a ritual that had been waiting for millennia for the right hand, the right mind, to complete it. My very existence had become the stage for an unseen, horrifying opera of damnation. I tried desperately to look away, to break the burning gaze, to sever the psychic link that now bound me. But the words were already burned into my mind, indelible, etched into the very core of my being. They commanded specific acts, designated specific, forgotten locations, demanded specific, horrifying offerings, not just symbolic gestures, easily dismissed, but real-world interventions, dark errands. I was now compelled, utterly unable to refuse, to perform. I was no longer an impartial observer, a mere academic scholar seeking truth. I was an agent, a helpless pawn in a cosmic game played by forces that cared nothing for human morality or sanity. The whispers became a constant companion, a secondary, insidious voice in my head, persuasive and utterly terrifying, planting seeds of doubt, terror, and perverse suggestion. This wasn't a choice anymore. It was an inescapable fate. A leash tightened with every passing moment around my very soul. The final lines that appeared, flaming and stark, declared my new purpose, my new horrific role. They spoke of gathering the lost, of opening the gates between dimensions, of ushering in an age of primordial chaos, of dissolving the very fabric of reality. They named me not Doctor but something else, a new title born of shadow and dread, a role I could not comprehend, let alone refuse or escape. The parchment, its immediate task momentarily complete, then folded itself with unnatural speed and precision, shrinking back into a compact, inert rectangle, before falling to the floor with a soft, final thud. The green light faded, the whispers died to a low, lingering hum, and the archive returned to its silent, oppressive darkness. But the silence was a lie. The whispers were still in my head, and the commands, now etched into my very being, were clearer than ever. My world had changed, not subtly, but fundamentally, catastrophically, irrevocably. The weight of what I had learned, of what I had become, presses down on me now, heavier than any tombstone, more suffocating than any grave. I had sought knowledge, and I had found it, but it was a knowledge that consumed the seeker, leaving only an empty husk. The secrets of the Vatican, the ancient conspiracies, were no longer abstract theories or historical curiosities. They are my living nightmare, unfolding moment by agonizing moment. And the names, the truly ancient names, now resonate within me, waiting for their inevitable moment. I should have let the archives claim their cursed artifact, rather than letting it claim me. I remember the exact moment the innocuous became the insidious, the academic became the apocalyptic. It was the whisper of a name, etched not in ink, but in the silence between the words of the Codex Mortis, a text so deeply buried within the Vatican's secret archives, its mere existence was heresy. I should have stopped when I first felt the tremor in the ancient parchment, a vibration from the abyssal truth it contained, but I kept reading, driven by a scholar's hubris, believing knowledge, however dark, was merely information. I didn't realize then that some truths are not merely observed but contracted. The initial findings were compelling, almost exhilarating. Cryptic footnotes referenced obscure papal bulls, detailing not just the cycle of life and death, but the office of death itself, not a force, but a role, a position ordained by something beyond human grasp, yet managed by a millennia-spanning organization, a shadow behind the Vatican's gilded facade. I thought I was imagining it until I found the first signature, faint yet undeniably human, beneath Old Aramaic for the bearer of the final severance. What kind of man, I wondered, would sign such a document? What profound commitment, ad infinitum? This was my first open loop, an itch I had to scratch. The deeper I delved, the colder the air became, a chill seeping not from the walls, but the words. Paragraphs detailed a meticulous, multi-generational succession plan, a cosmic passing of the torch. It spoke of a bloodline, purified through spiritual dedication and curated genetics, designed to produce a suitable vessel, a recipient for the divine burden. The Latin read, Sanguine Novo Designatus, designated by new blood. My hands, tracing the script, felt alien. I dismissed it as metaphor. How could I have been so blind to the obvious pattern forming around me, a pattern drawn in my own family's history, in the hushed tales of strange service to the Holy See? The paranoia began subtly, a sudden shift in the silence outside, a faint scent of ozone. My research became less about the text and more about understanding why I was reading it. Why had this ultimate heresy been accessible to me, a low-ranking archivist? My colleagues were always just out of sight, their footsteps echoing too long. I heard whispers of the chosen one in my dreams, not as honorific, but curse. Every shadow coalesced into a watching eye. My second open loop was forming. Who was they, and what did they want with me? This wasn't merely a discovery, it was an entrapment. Then came the scrolls, not bound, but rolled, tucked into a false bottom beneath the Codex Mortis. These weren't treatises, these were protocols, directives, a manual. They outlined rituals of transition, preparations, precise incantations, names that would summon not spirits, but the essence of the outgoing office holder. Spiritus mortis, tivoco. The words hummed in my bones. I didn't dare speak them. Instructions detailed celestial events and blood sacrifices, not of innocence, but of memories. A severing so total the new death would be an empty vessel. That was only the first mistake, thinking the sacrifice was external. My own family history transformed into a terrifying roadmap. My grandfather's eccentric pilgrimage to that remote monastery, his sudden return a changed man. My great-grandmother's mysterious illness, her isolation, her quiet passing on the predicted date of a lunar eclipse, all aligning with ritualistic prerequisites. It was as if a cosmic clock, set generations ago, was ticking down to me. I saw my life not as choices, but as a meticulously constructed path, every fork guided, every door opened or shut by an unseen hand. The linguistic proficiency, the pull towards esoteric theology, not passions, but preparations. I felt like a puppet, dancing on strings I thought were my own. The air grew impossibly thick, pressing down, making each breath a conscious struggle. The ultimate horror wasn't death as an office, or the millennia-long conspiracy. It was the chilling proof that I was the next in line. The final clause, hidden beneath ciphers and misdirections, bore my ancestral sigil, a mark I'd dismissed, and beneath it, my name. Not written by my hand, not of my time, but inscribed in a script so ancient it predated English, yet perfectly spelling out my identity. Tibi ad sumus, custos fati. We are here for you, keeper of fate. It wasn't a choice, it was a legacy, a debt collected. I should have burned the scrolls, screamed, but the words held me, paralyzed by the enormity. I saw the grooming for what it was, not education, but indoctrination, not knowledge, but conditioning. My whole life had been a meticulously orchestrated psychological experiment, designed to make me accept the unthinkable. The strange dreams of faceless figures, the sudden flashes of understanding, Latin I'd never learned, the inexplicable cravings for solitude, all symptoms of a mind being subtly reshaped, prepared to bear a burden no mortal should carry. They had crafted my mind, carved my destiny, etched it into my bloodline. The final clause wasn't a contract to be signed. It was a prophecy already fulfilled, a binding sacrament performed at my birth, a ritual without my consent. The transfer wasn't about a kill, it was about replacement. The current death was retiring, shedding its mantle. The pactum demanded a successor. The old death would find release from grim service, while I would begin mine. An eternity of loneliness, cold detachment, traversing the veil, a cosmic ferryman collecting souls, never truly living, never truly dying. The knowledge brought not just dread, but profound betrayal. My entire reality, a lie, a stage set for this cosmic horror. I understood now why the Codex Mortis spoke of surrender as the only exit, not from the office, but from the agony of resisting. The thought made my limbs heavy, my heart a leaden weight. I look at my hands now, not as my own, but as instruments soon to be wielded by an ancient force. I feel the creeping cold within, a foreign presence slowly asserting its dominion. The summoning words echo in my mind with terrifying insistence. I wonder if the ones who orchestrated this, the shadowy figures behind the Vatican's deepest secrets, the true keepers of this monstrous conspiracy, are even human, or are they simply ancient architects of a cosmic bureaucracy, ensuring existence turns, no matter the cost, to an unwitting soul? My will feels like a fragile thing, a thin membrane stretched taut against an encroaching tide. I can almost hear the soft, rhythmic click of the cosmic clock, ticking away the final moments of who I once was. Before the transfer, the countdown has begun. I understand now why the previous death sought not rest, but oblivion, a release from this eternal, agonizing office they have bestowed upon me. I remember the chill of the archive, a temperature preserved not by modern HVAC, but by centuries of forgotten prayers and the calcified silence of hidden knowledge. It was more than just cold. It was the absence of warmth, a vacuum that seemed to suck joy and light from the very air I breathed. My hands, stained with ink from countless illicit transcriptions, trembled not from fear, not yet, but from the immense anticipation of what lay before me. The parchment, the Liber Noctis Sacramentum, was not merely old. It felt alive, a sleeping beast bound by threads of forbidden scripture and the heavy lead seals of the Vatican's deepest, most sinister library. I should have stopped when the first sigil pulsed faintly beneath my trembling fingers, a barely perceptible throb that mirrored my own carotid artery. It was a warning, a whispered threat from a realm I had no business invoking. But the hunger for the truth, was a gnawing beast within me, louder than any cautionary voice. I had spent years peeling back the layers of deception, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of forgotten dogma and censored histories. The official narratives, the hagiographies spun for public consumption, were flimsy veils over a gaping maw of cosmic horror. My research had led me from obscure monastic texts in forgotten Irish abbeys to the cryptic annotations in Renaissance grimoires hidden within the clandestine collections of powerful aristocratic families. Each whispered clue, each half-erased name, drew me closer to Rome, to the sanctified heart of hypocrisy. I thought I was simply uncovering historical aberrations, forgotten cults, perhaps even a rogue faction within the church itself. I didn't realize then that I was charting a path not to mere history, but to a living, breathing entity, a consciousness woven into the very fabric of belief and dread. The true mystery wasn't what they hid, but who they hid it from, and why they devoted millennia to its suppression. The Liber Noctis Sacramentum was said to be a myth, a dark fable whispered by disgraced scholars and excommunicated priests, a compilation of incantations and rituals dating back to the earliest days of the Church, supposedly written by a cabal of Gnostic heretics who believed God himself was merely a jailer, and true divinity lay in the forbidden void beyond. It detailed a method of transcendence, a means to shed the corporeal cage and perceive the universe in its raw, unfiltered glory. A horrifying glory, they warned, for it was the glory of ultimate truth, and ultimate truth was madness. I remember laughing, a dry, brittle sound in that tomb of knowledge, at the audacity of such a claim. How naive I was, how arrogant in my academic detachment, believing myself immune to the very forces I sought to dissect. I thought I was imagining it when the words on the page seemed to shimmer, the ink deepening, twisting, as if the text itself was breathing, awaiting my touch. My task, I told myself, was purely archival, to transcribe the crucial passages, to bring this hidden knowledge into the light, however dim. The language was a composite of ancient Aramaic, corrupted Latin, and a series of glyphs that defied conventional decipherment, yet resonated with an instinctual understanding. It wasn't a language meant to be read with the eyes, but with the soul. Nomen infandum, veritas obscondita, lux tenebrarum, unspeakable name, hidden truth, light of shadows. The phrases became a rhythmic chant in my mind, a cadence that subtly altered my perception, bending the edges of reality. The flickering gaslight in the archives seemed to dim further, drawing the shadows closer, making them denser, almost sentient. I began to feel a presence, not human, but an echo, a resonance in the very dust motes dancing in the beam of light. I didn't realize then that the act of transcribing wasn't merely copying, it was communing. The climax of the text detailed a specific, intricate ritual of severance, of perception beyond the veil. It involved not sacrifice, but revelation. It spoke of shedding the physical form, not in death, but in a kind of absolute spiritual ascension, a transition to a state of being unseen by the flesh, yet ever present. The final step, the fulcrum of the entire process, involved inscribing a single, specific name onto a piece of blessed parchment, using one's own blood as ink, within the confines of a consecrated space. The name, Eliana, was not human. It was a concept, an aspect of primordial chaos, a key. My skepticism warred with an overwhelming, insidious compulsion. The academic in me screamed against such irrationality, but the deeper, darker part, the part that had craved this forbidden fruit for so long, urged me forward. My fingers, trembling now with a visceral primal fear, traced the lines of the ritual, feeling the subtle vibrations emanating from the ancient book. I found an abandoned chapel on the outskirts of Rome, forgotten by the church, left to crumble under the weight of time and disuse. Its desolation was its sanctity, its silence a perverse invitation. I brought the parchment, a sterile blade, and the copied text. The ritual was precise, demanding. The invocation of De profundis clamavi ad te, Domine, was followed by phrases that twisted the sacred into something profane, yet utterly potent. I sliced my palm, a quick, sharp pain, and watched my blood well up dark and viscous in the dim light. It was warm, surprisingly so, a stark contrast to the glacial chill of the chapel air. With a trembling hand, I dipped the tip of my quill into the crimson pool, feeling a strange surge of power, a buzzing current that ran up my arm and settled in my skull. This was it, the precipice. I should have turned back then, should have fled into the anonymity of the Roman night, consigning the Liber Noctis Sacramentum to oblivion. But I kept reading, kept following the instructions, a puppet on strings pulled by an unseen master. When my pen touched the parchment, tracing the ancient, forbidden name, Aeliana, the chapel convulsed. It wasn't an earthquake. It was something far more intimate, more terrifying. The very air shrieked, a sound that tore at the fabric of silence. The stones groaned, not collapsing, but shifting, as if the building itself were reconfiguring its molecular structure. The altar cracked down its middle, not from force, but from an internal stress, a release of pressure. My vision blurred, then sharpened with an intensity that burned my retinas. The gaslight extinguished, but the chapel wasn't dark. It was filled with a pulsating violet luminescence, emanating from nowhere and everywhere at once. My body felt like it was tearing apart at the seams, then reforming, not physically, but spiritually. There was a profound, wrenching sensation, a shedding of layers, a divestment of self. I was being unmade, then remade, into something other. This was only the first mistake, and I could feel it, even as the universe itself seemed to hold its breath. The silence that followed was worse than the scream. It was absolute, crushing, and I was alone. Or so I thought. I tried to move, to speak, but no sound escaped my lips. No sensation reached my limbs. It was as if I had become a ghost, not spectral, but simply unperceived. I looked at my hands, and they were there, solid, yet I could not interact with the dust motes still swirling in the now faint violet glow. My blood, spilled moments before, remained a wet, dark stain on the altar stone, but I couldn't feel its stickiness, couldn't wipe it away. A wave of profound, existential horror washed over me. I had achieved the unseen state. I had shed the corporeal cage. But it wasn't liberation. It was damnation. I tried to make sense of it, to rationalize, to find the scientific explanation, but the world around me was utterly indifferent to my presence, my desperate attempts to reconnect. I was no longer a participant. I was an observer, trapped behind an invisible wall. And that's when I saw it, or rather, felt it. A coldness, not of the air, but of pure absence, coalesce behind me. I turned, my unseeing eyes trying to focus on something, anything, and there it was, my reflection. Not in a mirror, but in the shimmering distortion of the chapel's air. A dark, perfectly still silhouette that mimicked my every movement, yet was utterly devoid of life, of light. It was death. Not the reaper with a scythe, but the absolute cessation of being, given form by my own transgression. It was me, but without the spark, without the fear, without the hope. It was the end point, already arrived, already waiting. It didn't threaten, it simply was, and it followed me, everywhere. A constant, chilling reminder of what I had forfeited, what I had become. Later I would understand that the Vatican wasn't just hiding a book. They were hiding the consequences of reading it, and the terrible truths it could unleash. They knew this path led to an invisible prison, a solitary confinement with the ultimate, relentless companion. I walk the world now, unseen by all, unheard, untouched. The bustling streets of Rome are a blur of color and sound. A symphony I can no longer conduct, only witness. The faces of strangers, once subjects of casual observation, are now poignant reminders of a life irrevocably lost. I pass through walls, through crowds, a specter tethered to existence by a thread of unceasing regret. The conspiracies I sought to expose now seem petty, irrelevant. What good is truth when you are no longer able to share it? What good is freedom when you are imprisoned in an invisible cage of your own making? Death, my silent shadow, never blinks, never falters. It is always there, just behind me, a breath away, a constant pressure on my spiritual back. It is waiting for the precise moment when the horror of my solitude, the full weight of my cosmic error, finally crushes me. The cold crown of eternity rests heavy on my skull, and I cannot remove it, cannot break free from this chilling, unseeing vigil, forever bound to a world that knows me not, yet is haunted by my silent, lingering despair.